he's talking about? Himself. The Messiah is here. And you can't figure this out. And so, it says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given except the sign of Jonah. And he left them and went away, and their mouths were open. They didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And so, Jesus, on the Matthew narrative, is now at a point where he is finished with his ministry. He knows that his time is short, and he knows that he wants to prepare the disciples to become the Christian church. But there's a few things he has to ask them, and they have to figure out. After all, they weren't prepared yet. And that disheartened Jesus. He had spent 3 years on it. And there are a lot of things they still had to learn. And so let's follow the narrative and see what it was that they had to learn. And perhaps, do you think Matthew is also written for us today?
Of course.
Maybe there's something here we can find that we need to learn too as we go through the narrative. 16 verse 5. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And as you read those verses, what were the disciples thinking about? Bread. Food. Jesus said, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they thought to themselves, oh, that's right. We didn't bring any bread. And as a Jew, we cannot eat bread that a Gentile has made. And so Jesus is telling us, watch out. You can't go to the other side, and they were headed to Gentile territory. You can't go over there, and you can't eat their bread. And all he was thinking about was bread. Jesus says, oh, dear. He said, don't you know what I'm talking about? It's not bread I'm talking about. What is it? It's the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which you can interpret the teaching. Their teaching. And what was their teaching? What was the incorrect teaching of the Pharisees? Put it simply, you work your way to heaven by rules and regulations. And as long as you're good on the outside and you follow all these things, you're going to make it. Jesus says that was the poison teaching of the Pharisees. Not left out. What was the teaching of the Sadducees? What was the terrible teaching of the Sadducees?
No resurrection.
No resurrection. And what was the Christian gospel going to be based upon?
The resurrection.
And if you didn't believe in a resurrection, and that was the leaven or the teaching. And Jesus was trying to tell them that they needed to be aware of those things. And that's what you basically have in verses 5 through 12. How is it, verse 11, you do not understand, I did not speak to you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. By the way, he did remind them if they needed bread, what could happen? Have you guys forgotten? And he talks about both events, right? He says, the feeding of the 5,000, what did I do? The feeding of the 4,000, what did I do? Have you forgotten that so quickly? Don't worry, here they were all concerned about bread, missing out on the teaching that Jesus was wanting to instruct them. Thank goodness. The scripture tells us there that they finally figured it out in verse 12. Oh, okay, we understand now. Good, we understand. As we go on to the next narrative, it says that Jesus and his disciples went over, they went across the lake, and they went to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, there's a picture of what it's like today. Caesarea Philippi, 25 miles north of Capernaum. At the base of Mount Hermon is where Caesarea Philippi was and is today. Its remains, ruins. Something is still there today that was there in Jesus' day, and that's the mighty spring that comes out of the base of Mount Hermon that is the beginning of the Jordan River. A giant spring. It's a beautiful place. And that's a picture of what it looks like today. And I thought I'd throw in a picture of Mount Hermon. There's Mount Hermon. And you see Mount Hermon, that's up towards the Golden Heights, that's Mount Hermon. You see the snow there? And that snow, as it would melt, would fill the spring at the base of Mount Hermon. And that's where Jesus took his disciples. Now you see, that's a lovely place. What a nice place. What an isolated place. That Jesus would take his disciples and try to teach them. Here is a picture, an artist's conception of what Caesarea Philippi looked like in the days of Jesus. We are told in Caesarea Philippi by historians that Caesarea Philippi, by the way, it was called Caesarea Philippi because there was already a Caesarea on the shores of the Mediterranean. So this is Philip's Caesarea. Who was Philip? He was the brother of Herod Antipas.